Trump running mate, Republican senator, MAGA snowflake, and all-around weird guy, JD Vance, lashed out at reporters at a particularly awkward press conference after they asked him a series of very brutal questions, and it was hilarious, and we have to talk about it. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video. The strain seems to be getting to JD Vance, the least popular vice presidential candidate in recorded American history, a guy who is being rightly categorized and characterized as just a weird person. Well, he didn't like the questions he was getting at a press conference earlier today, and it prompted him to lash out at the reporters. We're going to play these clips and unpack it together.
Hey, from NBC News. You have repeatedly suggested that the only reason Kamala Harris didn't pick Josh Shapiro to be her running mate is because of his Jewish faith. Do you have any evidence to support that assertion, that a person who's married to a Jewish man is somehow anti-Semitic or bowing to anti-Semites?
Well, I reject the premise of the question. I did not say that that was the only reason that Kamala Harris didn't choose Josh Shapiro. So you should, take a little less DNC talking points when you ask your questions and ask a real question.
So, of course, he's trying to pull off the Trump thing, fighting with the press. It's worked for Trump, at least with MAGA, in particular, MAGA Republicans. I think it's also contributed to the widespread unpopularity of Trump. As a reminder, Trump is not, was not, and shall never be a popular politician. So I'm not sure that Vance should pursue this particular line of inquiry. I mean, Trump is certainly more popular than Vance. Vance doesn't even have the requisite charisma to pull this off. It's ridiculous. So he says to a perfectly fair question, hey, listen, I didn't say that the vice president's anti-Semitism was the only reason she didn't select a Jewish governor to be her running mate. I said it was one of multiple reasons. And then he proceeded not to provide any sort of evidence because, of course, there is no evidence, right? This idea that Vice President Harris is anti-Semitic is ridiculous. But he's casting aspersions, at the Democratic Party, at the vice president, hoping to weaponize them. Meanwhile, the facts show that Jewish Americans vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. And to the extent that there are Jewish politicians in this country, most of them are Democratic. There are relatively few Jews in the Republican Party. So I'm not sure exactly what JD Vance is going for here. But I will say before we play some other clips with respect to that press conference, because they asked some pretty mean questions, fair questions, but I imagine they hurt his feelings. I do want to play this other clip too, which came from the day before, in which again, you can see the frustration in Vance, but he's getting fed up. He thinks the media is unfair, and he challenges the media to be fairer to Republicans. A media ecosystem which already grades the GOP on a curve. But I digress. This is JD Vance getting fed up with the press.
We're going to hit the road, but I want to make just one final observation. I know most of you. I like all of you as people, or at least I like the ones of you that I know. I think that you guys have got to do a better job at actually forcing Kamala Harris to answer questions. This is a person who's been the presumptive Democrat nominee for 16 days. She hasn't taken a single real question from a reporter. The American people deserve to get to know the people who want to lead them, and I think it's shameful for Kamala Harris, but increasingly for the media, that she's taking a basement strategy of running from reporters instead of getting in front of them, answering tough questions about her record, and letting the American people know who she is.
Yeah, so when Donald Trump is confronted with tough questions, people talk about, listen, well, at least Trump goes and answers tough questions. Number one, he doesn't answer softball questions, let alone tough questions. He gets hit with tough questions, and then he loses his temper and attacks the reporters asking him those tough questions, casts aspersions about them, their competence, their gender, their race. So this idea that Donald Trump takes fair questions or tough questions in stride is ridiculous. But you see the pattern here, right? JD Vance feels that he is being dealt a bad hand by the media. And I just think it's hilarious that he's so whiny about it. Some more clips, though, from that press conference earlier this morning. And I think this clip might be my favorite.
Detroit Free Press.
Thank you.
When Trump was at the NABJ conference, he was asked whether you'd be ready to assume the presidency on day one. And he responded by talking about how the vice president pick doesn't really impact the election outcome.
Sure.
Was that the response that you were hoping for from the former president?
Well, what the president has said, and I agree with him, is that most people are voting at the top of the ticket. Now, Tim...
I love that. That was such a brutal question, but perfectly fair, because you may or may not remember, but Trump did indeed say that at the National Association of Black Journalists when he was asked about his very unpopular, very strange vice presidential running mate. This is what Trump had to say.
When you look at JD Vance, is he ready on day one? Does he what?
Ready on day one, if he has to be.
I've always had great respect for him, and for the other candidates too. But I will say this, and I think this is well documented. Historically, the vice president, in terms of the election, does not have any impact. I mean, virtually no impact.
When you look at...
Love it. Yeah. I love JD. Enormous respect for him. But he's irrelevant. Nobody cares about JD. JD who? And then for JD to be asked about it again, love it. They're like, hey, so listen, recently Trump was asked about, whether or not he regrets picking you. And he's like, no, of course not, because you just don't matter at all. And then for JD Vance to go, I agree with the president. You just internally, you can feel the suffering where he has to debase himself, as all Republican politicians do, in their public service to Donald Trump's cult. How pathetic. In contrast, I want you all to think about this. That was Trump talking about JD responding to it. But last night, at the time of recording last night, Vice President Harris and Governor Tim Waltz of Minnesota had their first joint rally together the same day that it was announced that she had selected him to be her running mate. This is how she described their relationship and what she thought of Tim Waltz.
Tim Waltz will be ready on day one.
You imagine, JD, there's no doubt JD has watched this rally, and he probably was weeping openly. Like, I can't believe she thinks that her guy's ready on day one, but Trump doesn't think I matter at all. The contrast is staggering. The vice president recognizes that Tim Waltz is an asset. Now, maybe in terms of sheer electoral politics, it's not the most consequential thing in the world, but it does matter on the margins, I imagine, especially with an election this tight, and you're selecting a second in command. The vice president has no concrete constitutional duties besides being president of the Senate, and that is basically an artifact. You have a president pro tem in the Senate, which basically is assumed the president's or the vice president's legislative roles. So they have become much more of a creature of the executive branch. Historically speaking, they were supposed to have a foot in both worlds. It was going to be one of the checks of the executive on the legislature, that the president's second in command is also in certain places the chief administrative officer of one of two chambers of the legislature. But now that's really not the case. But you are picking somebody who assumes the awesome powers of the presidency if you resign, or if you die, or if you're incapacitated. This is the next in line to the throne, so to speak. So to say that person doesn't matter, he doesn't even say, listen, he's enormously competent. If something happens to me, the country will be in safe hands. It'll be in mature hands. No, just like, he's window dressing. He's wallpaper. It's so funny to me, the contrast. A couple more questions from this press conference, which were fair, but pretty brutal.
Donald Trump said something very simple, totally inoffensive, but frankly, obviously true to me, which is that Kamala Harris is a chameleon. She's a fake, and the American people have to look at her record if we actually want to know how she stands on the issues, because her words simply can't be trusted. Sir.
How can you fake your race? If
I'm sorry?
You're both Indian and black, how can she fake her race?
She fakes who she is depending on the audience that she's in front of, and that's who she is, and that's who she's always been.
Again, you can hear it. He's getting fed up. Oh, she's fake. How is she fake? She has both Indian and African-American heritage. How do you fake that? Well, she presents a different persona no matter where she is. That coming from JD Vance, of all people, that particular allegation is laughable. JD Vance, you want to talk about chameleon? You want to talk about changing who you are depending on your audience? JD Vance famously was a never-Trumper. He was an anti-Trumper. He said Donald Trump is an idiot. He's a narcissist. He's America's opioid. He's unprincipled. He's a loser. And then when it was politically expedient, he walked all of it back and became a proud Trump sycophant. So JD Vance is perhaps the last person on earth to cast aspersions or point the finger at other people for supposedly changing their persona. Just saying. Another clip from that press conference.
Sir.
Could
you speak a little louder? Sorry.
Will Jones from Local 4. I want to talk a little bit about race. I was at the National Association of Black Journalists conference last week where President Trump made some attacks on Vice President Harris's biracial heritage. You're married to an Indian American woman. You have biracial children. How do you explain his attacks, and what is your reaction to his attacks as a father of biracial children?
Yes, sir. So I am the father of biracial children. Actually, my wife is here today, though my kids are back home with my aunt today. And look, I was not bothered at all by what President Trump said, and I didn't take it as an attack on Kamala Harris's biracial background at all. What I took it as was an attack on Kamala Harris being a chameleon. She pretends to be one thing when she's in front of one audience. She pretends to be something else when she's in.
Again, just for JD Vance, of all people, to make that particular comment, just absolutely staggering. And then last clip, he takes a shot at Governor Tim Waltz, Vice President Harris's new running mate. This is what he had to say.
Well, I wonder, Tim Waltz, when were you ever in war? What was this weapon that you carried into war, given that you abandoned your unit right before they went to Iraq, and he has not spent a day in a combat zone? What bothers me about Tim Waltz is the stolen valor garbage. Do not pretend to be something that you're not. And if he wants to criticize me for getting an Ivy League education, I'm proud of the fact that my mamaw supported me, that I was able to make something of myself. I'd be ashamed if I was him and I lied about my military service like he did.
Are you implying Tim Waltz didn't make something for himself? Are you implying, sir, that people who don't go to an Ivy League school like Yale or Harvard, that they have not made something of themselves? Is that what you're implying there? It seems to be what he's implying. I do want to say, with regards to the claims of stolen valor, VoteVets, which is a Democratic coalition of veterans, they have released a fact sheet on this. Fiction versus facts. Tim Walz's record. Fiction. Tim Walz retired because he knew he was going to deploy to Iraq, which is what JD Vance is talking about. The fact is, according to VoteVets, bullshit. Tim Walz submitted his retirement request to the U.S. Army National Guard months prior to notification of his unit's deployment. So he submitted his retirement request before they even knew they were going to be deployed. The unit was fully sourced, staffed, and his request was approved. He retired in May 2005. Fiction. Tim Walz is using rank he didn't attain, and that's stolen valor. Facts. Bullshit. And the Minnesota National Guard says it's bullshit. It's entirely accurate to describe Tim as having been a command sergeant major, the rank under which he served, and the Minnesota National Guard has emphasized that in public statements. Now, in contrast, Mehdi Hassan, progressive commentator, also fact-check JD Vance on this. He said, number one, they're trying to swift boat Tim Walz. Number two, Walz served 24 years in the Army National Guard. Number three, Vance went to Iraq as a combat correspondent or military journalist. He did PR for the Marines. Number four, Donald Trump had fake bone spurs to dodge the draft, and that is, of course, JD Vance's cult leader. Alexander Vindman, who served in the Trump administration and is himself a veteran, responded like this. Vance enlisted and served 4 years, including 6 months in Iraq in 2005 as a reporter with a public affairs section of the Marine Aircraft Wing. Walz served 24 years, earning 8 promotions and ending as a command sergeant major, the highest NCO position. I don't think JD wants to compare records, but if he insists, it doesn't seem to look good for JD Vance. Also, to say nothing of this idea that unless you have served in active combat, that you don't deserve respect as a veteran, as somebody who's engaged in military service. Every time he tries to rebut notions that he's this really weird guy, he just digs a deeper hole for himself. So perhaps he should, not talk, ever, for any reason. It actually might help Donald Trump's chances in the election. But anyway, brutal press conference for JD Vance. He didn't handle it particularly well, both in the substance of his answers and his demeanor in which he lashed out at reporters. And I love it, and we should talk about it more. Let me know, in fact, what you think in the comments.